Before we start today, I just want to give you a quick heads up that we'll be talking about some violent crimes in this episode. I know we've got a lot of parents who listen to this podcast with their kids, so maybe give this one a listen on your own before letting the kids listen to it. Consider this your listener discretion is advised warning. Hello, and welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Normally, this is where I set up the episode by telling you what movie we're going to be covering today, give a quick synopsis, but today is going to be different, so we're going to need a few layers of setup. Let's start with the movies that we're talking about today. I've gotten a lot of requests for Mafia movies like Casino, Goodfellas, Donnie Brasco, even the TV show, The Sopranos. Today, we're going to be talking about all of those. So obviously, it's not a typical episode where we talk about just one movie. Instead, we're going to be talking about how well those movies depict the outfit, as well as the Mafia overall. That brings us to our next layer of setup, because we need to understand some of these mob terms. For example, we are going to be talking about the outfit today, and I'm not talking about clothing. So let's start with a quick minute or two on exactly what the outfit is, because it has been called many things over the years: the organization, the South Side Gang, or sometimes simply the mob or the Mafia. But the Mafia is a term for the overall organized crime syndicates across the United States. Of course, there's organized crime around the world, but today we're focusing on the Mafia in the United States. For example, you have a faction of the Mafia in New York known as the Five Families. In Chicago, the faction of the Mafia is known as the Outfit. Of course, New York and Chicago are run by different people, but as you might expect, over the 100 or so years that these crime families have been around, there's been a lot of connections between them. And the factions of the American Mafia are overseen by what's known as the Commission. The Outfit is the most powerful and violent organized crime syndicate from Chicago. You've probably heard of Al Capone. He was one of the most popular bosses in the history of the Outfit, as he ran it back in its early days in the 1920s and throughout Prohibition until he was put in prison in 1931. And the Outfit got a new boss by the name of Paul Ricca. He shared power with Tony Accardo, both of which are names that we're going to hear about today. And since then, the Outfit has been involved in everything from Hollywood movies, the casinos of Las Vegas, and even rumors of involvement with the Kennedys in the 1960s when a boss by the name of Sam Giancana ran the Outfit. As you can tell, there are a ton of stories we can talk about when it comes to the Outfit. And we'll start today with Casino, the 1995 film from Martin Scorsese, which talks about an associate from the Outfit in Chicago going to Las Vegas to run a casino. Then we'll shift to another Martin Scorsese film, Goodfellas. That's about a mobster from New York named Henry Hill. He's played by Ray Liotta in the movie, as well as Henry's friends. Since I mentioned New York, you'd be correct to guess that Henry was not in the Outfit. He was in one of the five families in New York. After Goodfellas, we'll touch briefly on the 1997 film directed by Mike Newell called Donnie Brasco. That's about an FBI agent named Joe Pistone who went undercover in the New York Mafia using the name Donnie Brasco. Now, the reason we'll touch on that briefly is because we actually covered that movie in more depth with Joe Pistone back on episode number 173 of Based on a True Story. But it's still very relevant to our discussion today, so I wanted to include it here as well. Lastly, we'll shift from mob movies to the hugely popular HBO series created by David Chase, The Sopranos. That's based on the DeCavalcante crime family, another faction of the Mafia based out of New Jersey. Our final layer of setup has to do with our guest today. Scott Hoffman probably isn't a name that you've heard of before, but considering our topic today, is that very surprising? Scott's father was in the Outfit for over 55 years, rising to become a consigliere, or a trusted advisor to Sam Giancana. At the age of 8, Scott started accompanying his father on business for the Outfit, and over the years, he learned the inner workings of how it all worked. Scott was in the room when the meetings took place. He saw the street enforcers dealing out punishment. He interacted with the real Goodfellas, the real Godfathers, and now Scott is an author of a thrilling book called Inside. Check out the show notes for this episode to pick up your own copy. Okay, with all of that setup done, there's one last thing that we need to do before we connect with Scott. That's to set up our game for today's episode. 2 truths and a lie. Now, if you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm going to give you 3 things. 2 of them are true, and 1 of them is a lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1, there have been over 1,200 murders in the history of the Outfit. Number 2, Scott's grandfather photographed Marilyn Monroe. Number 3, the Outfit in Chicago made about 10% of their income from the casinos in Las Vegas. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one is a lie. And of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. Now, you won't see Scott's video in this episode. Unfortunately, the remote recording provider that I was using simply failed to capture his video. So I was only able to get the audio side. But if you enjoyed today's episode, then be sure to let me know, and maybe we can get Scott back on the podcast to share some more stories, and we'll make sure to get the video working. All right, now it's time to connect with Scott Hoffman about the Mafia in the movies. We have a few movies to chat about today, and the first one is the 1995 film directed by Martin Scorsese called Casino. Now, if we were to take a step back and look at the movie from an overall perspective to give it a letter grade for how accurately it portrayed the Mafia, what would it get?
I would say probably a C, maybe a C minus.
C or C minus? Okay. That's actually, that's not bad. Of course, it's not a documentary or anything like that. It's still pure entertainment. It's not bad.
I'm giving them a break a little bit on that, because there were some things that were close, but there were some things that were not close.
Yeah.
So I'm being fair to Martin Scorsese. I'll be, give him a break.
Sure. And again, it's a movie, so you're going to have that. Early on in the movie, we do see kind of how the outfit gets paid by the casinos in Vegas. And the way the movie sets it up, we see someone going into the count room in the casino, and they take out some cash in a briefcase. That briefcase is taken to Kansas City, which the movie says is the closest that the Midwest bosses can go to Vegas without getting arrested. That suitcase is because, at least again, this is the way the movie explains it, they control the Teamsters Union in Vegas. So that's where you go to get a loan for a casino. And that loan only comes if you get a suitcase, like a monthly suitcase of cash in return, basically. And that's how the movie explains how the outfit got paid by the casinos in Vegas. Does the movie Casino do a pretty good job of explaining how they really made their money in Vegas?
No, not really. They did not. That is in that one area, especially in my book Inside, which my book Inside is, while fictional, it's the people and events are composites of real people and real events. And the uniqueness of the book was seen through the eyes of an 8-year-old, because I'm going to Las Vegas in 1956 with my father, Saturday when I'm 8. No, the only thing that they would have got right was the word count room. Okay, because what happened basically was that was about it. Okay, because basically what would happen would be that usually the pit boss, now whoever was running the casino would have the pit boss go into the count room. And I spent a lot of time in count rooms. In count room, you'd go in about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, 3:30 in the morning. That's when you'd be going in. And all the money would be brought in. And the outfits take at that point was 10% every day, 10%. Okay. And the hotel owners, which had the license, and that's one thing the movie never explained. They obviously just talking about casino, but that's not really how things ran. Okay. And then the money would be, as I talked about Inside, in my book, I talk about this, that the money was counted. It was put in an envelope. The pit boss had to sign the day, the time, and his name, and then print his name. Okay. And they would do that with several envelopes and then put them in a duffel bag. And then they were put in a van and driven out to a building, which my father had bought and created it to look like it was owned by a construction company. Georgia Construction Company was the name he put on there. There was no Georgia Construction Company, but if you drove by, you would say, oh, it's just a construction company. The money was taken in there. There were 3 guys that were in there. Okay, they were armed with shotguns, 38s, 45s, and they would have to sign that they got the money. They got the envelope. Same thing. They'd have to put the time they got it, the day they got it. They'd have to sign for it and then print their name. And there were messengers. There were messengers from the outfit that brought the money back to Chicago. Now, what the movie was portraying, maybe that occurred when Alan Dorfman got involved. Okay. And that was the reason he got involved. He was executive director of the Teamster Union, was because my father, and he would joke about it, he said it was like General Douglas MacArthur being called back by President Harry Truman from Korea that Tony Accardo in April of 1966 was removing Sam Giancana from day-to-day operations. And Tony Accardo wanted my father, who my father reported to, was also a consigliere for Sam Giancana, was a manager for Plaurica, also a consigliere for Joe Iappo, who took over in 1973. Tony Accardo wanted him in Chicago. He said, things are running great in Las Vegas. We'll let Dorfman handle it from, whatever has to be done. But I need you here in Chicago because things were starting to get wild, very wild. Between 1966 and 1973, was kind of remind me like in the early 60s, P.K. Wrigley, who was the owner of the Cubs, decided rather than having a manager for the team, he was going to have revolving coaches. So many, like say the hitting coach would be the manager for so many games and the pitching coach. Well, with the outfit, the problem was whoever was put in to run day to day was under a federal indictment. So they'd last a year. And then you had another guy who'd be under another federal indictment. It was going on and on and on. And it was getting wild. Of course, it was getting wild because day-to-day operations, you have to remember everything that was brought into the outfit at that time was $200 million. And $100 million was coming from Las Vegas.
Wow.
All right. And normally every mob family has a rule. And this is a standard rule that cops and kids are off limits. Right. But because of the money coming from Las Vegas, that rule didn't apply to me. It never applied to me. So that's why when I was 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, I'm seeing not only mob activities, but I'm seeing my first murder at 9 years old. At 11 years old, I'm seeing a guy's hands cut off because he owed juice money. When I was 12 years old, the same guy who cut the guy's hands off when I was 11, he decapitated a guy who owed juice money. These guys were still alive and screaming. So, yeah, I mean, it was something. But, like I say, the messengers who were chosen were guys either that had a part of the outfit. They were either members or maybe made guys. But we also had Chicago police officers who either were fired from the job or had resigned from the job. We had 50 total police officers, Chicago, on the payroll. And 30 of them were active officers. 20 of them were either, like I say, either had been fired or they quit knowing they were going to be fired. And there was maybe 3 or 4 of them that would wind up in the book, okay, in Las Vegas's Black Book at that time. And that's, another story, what the movie didn't really come across, about this black book, what was going on with that. And so they were basically the ones who'd be bringing the money back, okay? And they'd be bringing them back money either to my father, to Tony Accardo, or someone else who was designated to get the money and then distribute the money. That's how it was done then, okay? Dorfman, when he took over, who knows what he was doing, but he didn't listen to my father because my father said to him, Alan, be careful, Alan. And he wasn't careful. He was not careful because in 1970, he was convicted. He pled guilty, got a year for embezzlement along with other guys from the Teamster pension fund. So it's quite a long story about Alan Dorfman. We could do a whole show on that.
It'll be a different one. Yeah,
that's how things were. That's how things were done.
It sounds very different than in the movie. It just seems, of course, it's in broad daylight in the movie, and it just seems like it's just go in and out. Nobody pays attention, but it seems like there's a very a lot more chain of command, who's tracking all the money too, a lot more organized.
Well, sure. Because first of all, I'll tell you why the problem with the movie was this: Kansas City reported to Chicago. That was one of the families who reported to Chicago. So there was no way that they were going to send, at least my father, I'll say him. I won't say what Dorfman was doing. But my father, Tony Accardo, Sam Giancana, there was no way the money was going to go to Kansas City because they weren't sure. First of all, they weren't sure if they could trust Kansas City and how it was going to be tracked. Or were they going to skim their own money to say, well, we're charging you for a rent fee, So there was no way it would have went to Kansas City. And like I say, Kansas City reported to Chicago. Okay, so that would not have happened. Okay.
Yeah.
And they would not have, mobsters would not have been worried about getting arrested. I'll tell you why. Because if their name is not in the Black Book, and that was the Nevada Gaming Commission, and they would put mobsters' name in the Black Book. Okay. And if your name was put in the Black Book, like Sam Giancana, his name was put in the Black Book, you could not go into a casino because the casino would lose their license. There was no give them a second chance, let's fine them. No, the casino's license would be pulled. And you have to remember the way my father set it up was that he had private investors who got the license. These were all business people who were able to get the license because the Nevada Gaming Commission is not going to give a gambling license to mobsters. Okay. So the deal would be, well, the outfit would run the casino, but the businessmen would run the hotel. But my father was very clear on this, Dan, very clear, that you bring in hotel people to run the hotel operation. You guys might be good in your own business, but you don't know a darn thing about the hotel business. And we want people to be happy. The whole thing with Las Vegas was we want people to go back to their towns and tell their family and friends the wonderful time that they had in Las Vegas and that you got to go word of mouth. My father was very clear with these guys. And because knowing who my father was, they didn't monkey around. And what he would tell them, he says, I'll have someone from the casino talk to you every day. And if you need their assistance, they will help you. In other words, if they're having problems with somebody, like what happened one time with Lee Marvin, the actor at the Fremont, that's another story. But yeah, so that's how it was really run. Okay. But it was not a fear of going to Las Vegas because there were mob guys who came from other cities to see Las Vegas, but their names were not in the book. So they could go into a casino and not have a problem. So this thing about they were afraid of being arrested, that didn't really work because Sheriff Ralph Lamb, who was a legendary guy, you can look up at LAMB or your listeners can look him up, was legendary. I'll never forget, I'm with my father. And he says to my father, you guys know how to run the inside. We're going to run the outside. Don't worry. Meaning they'll take care of the street. You guys take care of the inside. And we never had a problem. Okay. So there was never a situation where if, say, Sammy Gravano would be walking down Las Vegas Boulevard that somebody was going to arrest him. That wouldn't happen. Okay. Because he wasn't in the black book. They would have figured he's a tourist. And I'm using Mr. Gravano as an example.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, that is very different than what we see in the movie. When you were talking about kind of the change of command there and something that reminds me of something that is a key plot point in Casino with Joe Pesci's character, Nicky. He seems to kind of go rogue and even has a plan to take down the outfit's boss. Remo Gaggi in the movie is his name. And he's kind of trying to take control for himself. How realistic would it be for that sort of mutiny that we see happening in the movie Casino to actually have happened in the outfit?
Well, that wouldn't happen at all because that character was based on Tony Spilotro. Okay. And Tony Spilotro was sent out there in 1979. No, I'm sorry, around 1969. He was out there 15 years and he was going off the rails a lot of times. It was maybe by 1978, 79, he was put in the black book. Okay. So he couldn't go into a casino. He was put out there as the muscle. He was the second guy. Okay. But the problem basically was his brother Michael was telling everybody that someday Tony's going to run day-to-day operation. Well, you know, Dan, if you're a boss over a staff, do you want to hear your staff saying, someday you're going to be running, you're going to get my job? No, that's not going to happen. Okay. So there was no way that was ever going to happen. One of the things when Tony Accardo took over in 1943, and he called my father and was very concerned about the Black Hands, which would be the whole story on the Black Hands. It's something different. And Al Capone was a Black Hand. And he said, I don't want to be like those animals in New York. We're going to have a one-man operation. And basically that's what the outfit was. And the outfit today, there's still 4 street crews. It's a one-man operation. The crews report basically to one boss. It's not like New York with 5 families, 5 individual bosses. We're going all over the place sometimes, not recognizing territory and things like that. Tony Accardo never wanted to be like New York. He didn't care about New York. He told my father in 1943, when he took over after the Hollywood trial, which is another story, he said, I don't want to be like those animals. And in fact, I will tell you this, when Sam Giancana was removed, he asked Paul Ricca, who actually was a bodyguard for Al Capone, very smart guy, and brought Tony Accardo in as a driver and a bodyguard. He asked Paul to go on the Mafia Commission, okay, which still exists today. but they don't meet. The underbosses and captains of various families will meet. Chicago still is on the commission today, and they're represented by the Genovese family. But Tony Accardo, didn't even want to go on the commission after he pulled Sam Giancana at that point. And Sam Giancana was the guy, because of what went on between the Kennedys and the outfit, which is another long story, how it actually began. He was the guy who pushed. He was the guy who really pushed for the assassination. So that's another story.
You mentioned the Black Hand with Al Capone. What is that phrase that I'm not familiar with that term.
Okay, the Black Hands were this. They were all Sicilians. They were all Sicilians who came to America. And as far as now, my father played cards with these guys in his teenage years. He knew these guys playing cards. They trusted him. But the Sicilians, the Black Hands rather, they were all extortionists. Okay. But as far as they were concerned, if you were not Sicilian from Sicily, you could not be in the Mafia or the mob. They would accept Northern Italians, but they would say to them, you will never be in a leadership. You can be part of the mob, but you can never be leadership. You're not from Sicily. You're not Sicilian. And of course, any non-Sicilian, forget about it. They weren't even going to look at them. They didn't want them at all. They accepted my father because he played cards with them. And when my father became a manager, he was in his 20s. When Paul Rica asked him to be a manager, he put him over to Black Hands. And the first thing he said to him, what's your beef? What's your problem? He said, well, we don't know when we're going to get paid, which in mob life is true. Okay, you don't always know. That's why guys took no-show jobs with the state of Illinois, city of Chicago, the county. My father worked regular jobs, legit jobs, so he could get a W-2, which is, another story. And so he said, look, you guys hit the street, and then I'll talk with Paul, and you're going to have to pay tribute. And paying tribute means you have to kick up a percentage to the boss. And it was 10%. They said they'd be fine with it. So what the Black Hands would do is basically they went into a business and they would say to them, well, we hear that the neighborhoods, there's some problems in the neighborhood and that you need protection. And the owner would say to them, you're crazy. It's a good neighborhood. There's nothing going on here. And how they would start was that night they break the windows. Okay, that'd be the beginning. And then after that, they'd come back to the guy and they would say to the owner, they said, these guys are violent. We're concerned about your life. And that was the phrase, your life, telling the guy, okay, phase 1 was break the windows. Phase 2 is you. And so they pay extortion money. And the Black Hands were all over Chicago. They were not, they were very uncontrollable. And I will tell you this, there's a note of history where Mayor Anton Cermak, who supposedly took a bullet for Franklin Delano Roosevelt like in 1932, 33 in Miami. And that's not the real story. Not even close. That's not the real story of why Cermak was killed. He was killed by Black Hands because he was going to clean up Chicago and get the mob get the outfit out of Chicago. Yeah, that's a whole nother story.
Whole other story there. Speaking of another story, if we kind of shift on from the movie Casino to another Martin Scorsese movie, 1990s Goodfellas. From an overall perspective for Goodfellas, if you were to give that one a letter grade for how accurately it depicted the mafia, what would you give that one?
That would be probably I'd give him a D+.
D+. So a little bit better than Casino, but still, or it's a little bit worse than Casino, but still, yeah.
There were a few things. Well, because when I went to college, Long Island University, I'd gotten an academic scholarship after I had gone to a junior college. After telling my father, which is, again, with me, it's another. So with me, I can tell you 12 stories that relate to one story. So I apologize to you and your listeners. I really do. But with me, it rolls on. And I'd taken the one creative writing class at junior college. And the teacher thought I was a pretty good professor. And his college roommate, who was from Brooklyn, they went together to the University of Illinois. That's where they both, graduated. The professor is talking to his roommate and says, this fellow, Scott Hoffman, I want to show you his work. He's pretty good as a writer. And the fellow started to tell me his aunt worked in the admissions office for Long Island University, which I never heard of in Brooklyn, New York. So he was telling me about it. I figured, okay, I went to my public library, Chicago Public Library branch in my neighborhood. And I talked with the librarian, very nice. And she said, yes, we have a college reference books of listing of all the colleges. Let's look it up and see. So we looked it up. I got the address. I wrote them a letter. They said, send me transcripts because they give 2 out-of-state scholarships, okay, academic, but you're going to have to be responsible for your own room and board. Now, when I was going to junior college, I was working part-time because the junior college, the first class started at 8 in the morning and the last was 9 at night. So it was very convenient for night students. If you had to work during the day, it was convenient for night students. So I applied and they accepted me and I went to New York. I'd never been to New York before. And I was looking at some of the jobs posted by the admissions office to see what was available. And most of them were very low pay in those days. $1.35 an hour, $1.50, because we're talking September of 1968. So the jobs weren't high pay. So I did what I did best. And I was in a classroom with a guy and I'm telling him I need some work to cover my room and board. I had brought money with me. But it was like $600 in those days. It wasn't a lot, but still I had to work to come up with the money. And I'm telling him, and I thought he's going to bug out and say, oh, you're crazy. And he says, no, I might know somebody. And he did. The guy's name was Charles Scarfa, who was known as the Grim Reaper. He was a Colombo family guy. He was involved with maybe 100 murders. Wow. He was also used by the FBI when they were looking to try and find out who killed the 3 civil rights guys in 1964 in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Michael Schwerner, Michael Goodman, and I think his name Don Chaney. I think that was the other guy's name. 2 white guys and a black guy. So they used him. I don't know why they used him, but they used him. He was able to help. So I worked, my first MAP social club was, I worked at Colombo. Now at that time in New York, the drinking age was 18 and I was like 19, almost 20. So I could work in it. Later when the federal government changed the law, that every state had to be 21. That was different. In Illinois, it was 21. But in New York, when they told me 18, I was surprised. I thought it was 21. So I worked there. And then someone said to me, well, I think you could earn a little more money. And I know somebody that could help you. It was Lucchese Crime Family. And it was the suite owned by Henry Hill. It was in Queens, on Queens Boulevard near Forest Hills. And I went to meet him, and he was, I don't know, to me, he was kind of a twerpy guy, to be honest with you. I know we think a lot of. And he said, no, we can use you. Okay, fine. And so he hired me. And that's where I met and got to know all the real Sopranos. I mean, all the real Goodfellas. And I eventually met all the real Sopranos, the Bayardo family. That's who David Chase used in the television show The Sopranos, is the Bayardo family. Pretty much ran Newark. I later met them. But Goodfellas, yeah, I knew all of them. And things were not quite like the movie was making it.
Yeah, we'll talk about Sopranos here in a little bit, but before we leave the Goodfellas, since you did meet the real Henry Hill, do you think the movie did a good job portraying him with Ray Liotta's playing him?
No, in fact, then in 1998, I was in California and I was invited to a party, and who comes with Ray Liotta and a couple actor friends. So, and he goes out to the garden area. He says, I'll be right back, to his friends. I figured, okay, I'm going to go ask him about Henry Hill. And we had a gold compact. He was a heavy smoker in those days. And I was very sorry to hear when he passed. I don't know if he still was smoking at that time, but he was a heavy smoker. And he was smoking. And I said, Mr. Liotta, I really enjoy your work. And I got to ask you about somebody. He says, sure, go right ahead. And I said, what'd you think of Henry? And he says, Henry who? I said, well, the guy you played in Goodfellas, what was his name? Henry Hill, is that his name? He says, he was kind of scary to me. And I'm thinking, here's Ray Liotta, he plays all these tough guys. And he's telling me he's kind of scared, And he said, how do you know Henry? And I said, well, I was just in passing. I wasn't going to tell him how I knew Henry. I said, just kind of in passing. Okay. But to me, Henry Hill was, I always saw him. He was always afraid. His body language was afraid of Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario. Always really was afraid. And he was one of these guys to me. And I'll use an analogy. This is the same analogy that a kid who lives across the street from a drug dealer and sees all the nice clothes the guy has, and cars and women and jewelry. And that was pretty much, Henry Hill was a mob groupie as a kid. And he was the type of guy, in my opinion, that would do anything to win favor with wise guys, okay? He would do anything. So, I mean, that's not why they didn't like Henry. But, to me, He was not a guy to be afraid of. He wasn't Sam Giancana, I'll tell you that. Okay, he wasn't Tony Accardo, but yet he did whatever they wanted, and that's why he was involved. And like I say, all of them were Jimmy Burke, Paul Vario, the real Tommy, who was very psychotic, which is another story, Tommy DeSimone, okay, and Angelo Seppi were heavily into cocaine. And I knew Pittsburgh guys from the Pittsburgh mob. One of the guys there was, his name was Eugene Gasola, called Nicky the Blade. He was a slasher, always using and he was the contact, not only on the guns that when they showed in the movie, but the cocaine. He was the contact that brought the cocaine to New York that Henry Hill would buy, which she got money for, and they would be all smoking. And Henry Hill would always say to me, what, you want something? And I'd say, no, no, I'm not into drugs unless prescription. I'm allergic. I told him, I'm allergic to cocaine. Okay. And Jimmy Burke says to me, sure. And Jimmy Burke wanted me to work at his place, Roberts Lounge, which is located in South Ozone Park near LaGuardia Airport. And a kind of a little bit older Lucchese guy said to me, Scott, let's go outside. I want to tell you something. Okay. He says, look, you can do what you want. Jimmy Burke, okay, he'll pay you more money. But I'm telling you right now, they bury guys in the bar. So if you want to be around that, that's on you. That's up to you. So I go back and I say to Jimmy Burke, well, my class schedules, thanks, Jimmy, a lot. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. But just because of my class schedules, I just don't think I could swing it. And this time here with Henry at the suite, it works a little more. But thank you so much. Thanks a lot for thinking of me. He said, oh, that's great. Thanks. So I got along with him. Tommy DeSimone I got along with because in 1957, Los Angeles became one of mob families who reported to Chicago. And two of his uncles were part of the LA mob. And when we first met, I've been told that this happened a few days before we even met. There was this gentleman walking down the street. It was a middle-aged gentleman by the name of Howard Goldstein, just walking down the street, just like if you or I would be walking down the street. And Tommy called him a bad name and put 3 in the hat. And 3 in the hat means put 3 in the back of the head. Oh, wow. Okay. And then he put 2 in the chest. So the next day when I'm seeing Tommy, I'm saying, that happened about a week before I met Tommy. I said, why'd you shoot Howard Goldstein? He says to me, Scott, I had a new gun. I had to try it out. Wow. And so Tommy DeSimone was the type of guy my father would say, he's never going to live to 30. And Tommy DeSimone was killed when he was 28. Wow. But he was a very psychotic guy. And his sister, who was 16 years old, was having an affair with 42-year-old Jimmy Burke. Wow. So, yeah, that was a Goodfellas.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Going back to something that you talked about with Henry Hill, the real Henry Hill, when you're saying that he was trying to gain favor with wise guys and make them happy. And that's similar to something that we saw in the movie. I think Ray Liotta's version of Henry Hill mentioned something like, as far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster. And it tells the story from his perspective and kind of growing up in Brooklyn neighborhood around gangsters. And he seems to idolize them. Of course, everybody's situation is different, but you had a similar sort of decision to make about whether or not you would follow in your father's footsteps. Was there a lot of pressure to stay in the life like Henry Hill did in the movie?
No, it was completely the opposite. In fact, my father, when it all started at 8 years old, he said to me, at that age, he said, Scott, look, it's going to be your decision what you want to do. Okay. But I want your eyes open. You're going to see everything. It's going to be rough. It's going to be hard, but you're going to see everything, all facets, everything in mob life. Okay. And then you're going to make the decision. He says, I'm not going to make it for you. You're going to make the decision. Because other hosts have said, well, was he grooming you? No. And that was really an exception. Because in mob families, the father will really want his son, he'll do things that show his son that it's a good life. Or the uncle will show the nephew, yeah, you can make more money, which is why I really never dated the little Madonna's mob daughters or mob nieces, because what they would do, like say a fellow, we'll use you as an example, Dan. And they would, they would say to you, Dan, come down the basement. I want to, just talk for a little bit. And you'd say, great. This is if your relationship was getting a little more serious with Angela or Maria, And they would say, yeah, Dan, how much money do you earn on these podcasts? And say how much you earn. And a wise guy would say, the father or the uncle would say, that's nice, but my niece or my daughter, she's used to the better things, Dan, the better things. So I don't really know if you can afford on that salary, but I can make you a great offer if you come with me. If you come with me, Dan, you'll be making a lot more money. And you got to remember the daughters or the nieces, why I call them little Madonnas, because they were spoiled. When they were 16, they had the Corvettes. When they were 17, they had the tennis bracelets. Oh, yeah. They would be shopping at Lord and Taylor or Neiman Marcus. So they were used to that life, and they wanted a guy who could provide for that life. So that's what they would do. So at that point, Dan would have to make a decision. Do I end this relationship, or do I decide to go into the life, as mob life is called? And I never wanted that.
Yeah, I don't blame you, but it makes sense then hearing that, how someone like Henry Hill and how we see it portrayed in the movie, at least, that there would be, kind of tantalizing, to make more money. And it seems like it's better than it is. It sounds like your experience there, as you mentioned, is a little different in that you saw a lot and you were more aware rather than just, I'm going to make a lot of money and have do good things.
I mean, the difference with me was by seeing it young, and it was very hard. And I didn't think about it till I was in my 20s. By seeing it so young, by the time I was, say, 16, which most guys, if they went to high school, they dropped out, but they had no idea what they were getting in. Then I was a hardened, seasoned veteran. When you talk about a hardened, seasoned veteran, you're looking right at them. Okay, I knew all facets of the life. I knew what was going on. I knew a lot of things about a lot of people. I didn't have any expectations. Where when guys go at life 16, 17 years old, they've got these expectations. Like I say, it's like the kid who lives across the street from the drug dealer. He doesn't think about what the legal consequences are going to be. That doesn't enter into his mind. All he sees is, hey, this guy got more money. Why should I work at McDonald's? Look at all the money he's got. Look at what he's making. See, and it was like that with Henry Hill when I say a mob groupie. He's seeing all this money flashing because a lot of guys will flash that money. And he's thinking to himself, wait a minute, this is a lot more money than I could ever make on a straight job. But he found out down the road what things were all about. And he was eventually kicked out of the WPP program. That's a witness, program, for witness protection program. He was kicked out of that when they had to move him so many times to Seattle. And that's why in 1989, his wife left him. Karen left him at that time. Okay. But neither him or Karen were faithful. Karen was having an affair with Paul Vario, okay, when Henry was in jail. And Henry was running around with women on her. So it wasn't like a happy marriage, but she was going back to New York. And the FBI handler says, don't go back to New York. This guy's going to be looking for Henry. Okay. So they'll grab you and they're going to force you to tell, where's Henry? She said, I don't care. I don't want this life because wherever they put Henry, because they put you west of the Mississippi in a WPP program, Witness Protection Plant program, they put you west of the Mississippi. They don't put you east. So he was constantly being moved because what he was doing was going back to criminal life, selling drugs. He was going right back to it. So eventually, when he got to Seattle, they just got tired of it. They kicked him out of the program. Okay. They kicked him out of the program.
Wow. One thing I wanted to ask about in Goodfellas, as I was watching that again to prepare for our chat, something that stood out to me was something that's throughout the entire movie. And there's just this level of paranoia that we have. It's constant paranoia that law enforcement's going to find them. There is a scene in Goodfellas with Ray Liotta's character, Henry Hill, we've been talking about. He's looking up nervously at, a helicopter above flying over. He thinks the helicopter is looking for him. But then to contrast that, there's times in the movie where we see guys, just jumping to violence so quickly without really seeming to care who sees it. So you have some scenes where Henry or people are just extremely paranoid. And then you have scenes of wise guys doing brutal beatings in broad daylight in front of who knows how many witnesses. Did the guys in the Mafia really live in this constant state of paranoia while also maybe not really caring who sees their crimes?
No, it wasn't, they were always concerned. They were always concerned uh, because they knew, what the consequences would be, especially when the RICO Act came in April of 1970. That changed. I'll never forget when I come out in March of 1970 on a spring break from college. I'd read about it in the New York Times, and I said to my father, the RICO Act was Racketeering Influence Corruption Organization Act. That's what it was called. It was written actually by Robert Blakely, who was the law professor at Notre Dame for Congress. I don't know why they picked him, but they picked him. And I asked my father, well, this isn't going to really bother the outfit or anything. He says to me, Scott, in years to come, not today, not tomorrow, the rats are going to be jumping off the ship.
Mm.
And that's because the law was you'd have to do at least 85% of the time, unless, and this is another thing that the public doesn't know, they have a lot of programs in prison, okay, like alcohol programs and drug programs. And if you qualify, that'll cut some of your time, all right? That'll cut some of your time. So you're not always doing straight 85%. But because of that, the 60-year-old guys, the guys in their 50s, they were concerned about that. But guys were never paranoid. They were concerned, obviously, because it was always a case of where the law enforcement, the FBI, that was their job, okay? So they're trying to make cases against you all the time. So they were concerned about it, but it wasn't a paranoia like that. And as far as the other, no, you'd never be doing that in public to anybody. In fact, I'll tell you this. When my father got the order on someone, and now in the movies, they always, or television, they'll say whack somebody, but there's another terminology. And the other term is give him his receipt. So Dan, if you're in a store or your listeners are in a store and the clerk says, Mr. Lefevre, would you like your receipt? You have those feet pointed at the door and you run out as fast as you can because giving a receipt means kill him. So when my father would go, and another thing public doesn't know is that if you put a contract out on someone, that was considered their job. Unless you put money on the contract, then it became different. That was rare, but that was your job, okay? If you were the muscle and the order was given on somebody, you didn't get paid extra for it. Where they got paid extra, and again, the public and probably yourself, you're not aware, is when they go out as juice collectors, okay, or street enforcers. A juice collector would be collecting either gambling money or loan sharking money, interest, juice on it. That's what they refer to it. And the street enforcers were collecting street tax on businesses. Now, the juice collectors would get half. So that's why they were so aggressive, because they're getting 50% of what they bring in. It'd be like Dan would get 10% commission besides straight salary, okay? And so that's why they were aggressive. And so those are two things, just as an example, the public doesn't know. And of course, movies aren't going to really tell you that. They're just going to show you a guy with a baseball bat. And that wasn't even always the case. I saw a lot of different beatings with a lot of different things, all right? But as far as that, when my father would get the order and he would talk with, because they pretty much left it up to him who he'd want to use if when the order was given on someone, that the guy would always say to my father, do you want him to make his confessional or do you want him to make his confirmation? And the confessional meant, did you want the body to be found? And the confirmation was you didn't want the body to be found. And that was always came up. But as far as any beatings, no, never. That would never happen, that, out in public like that. Because again, like you say, somebody could see it. Now, guys did some crazy, stupid things, and people saw it. Sure, and they got caught, but nobody would be out there. If anything, if they go real early in the morning, see, basically what they would do, they'd tail a guy for a period of time and see what time he went to work, what time he came home. And if he went to work early in the morning, they would be in the driveway with the guy and get out and put a gun in his ribs and say, get in the trunk. So unless somebody's out walking their dog at 6 a.m, that was as far as it went. They weren't going to stand there and beat anybody with people walking down the street. That was never going to happen. Okay? Because obviously if someone sees, give you an example. In 2014, there were 14 Colombo guys who were arrested. And the guys who weren't arrested, the old timers went crazy. And the reason they went crazy, there was about maybe 5 guys under the age of 40 who they texted a guy saying, if you don't pay, we're going to break your legs. Well, why would you text anybody? Okay. Because now the guy has a text and he's showing it to the FBI. Okay. So the old guys went crazy. They said, we got to do something with these guys. I hear that, through the mob grapevine, we got to do something. And I tell the guys, look, the younger generation is used to using cell phones. They're used to texting and they don't always think, but you're not going to text somebody that you're going to do something physically because that's evidence. Okay. And the one thing you learn about, and I spent a lot of time in courtrooms, an awful lot of time, is that one of the things that counts in trying to convict someone, you have to show intent. Okay. You have to show intent because intent is mental state. That's basically, we'll just skip around here for just a second. That's basically what the special prosecutor is doing with Donald Trump by tapes, emails, whatever. He's trying to show intent. You have to show intent. So if you're going to charge a guy with assault and you have a text message, that's intent because you're telling the guy, I'm going to break your legs if you don't pay. So does that make any sense to you?
It does. It does. Is that why, like, you're talking about using a term of like, do you want the confessional and things like that, and using terms like that? Is that part of the reason why too? Because then if somebody does overhear it, then it doesn't seem as straight out as what they're actually going to be doing. They're kind of using code words almost.
They don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. It'd be like when that was one thing I always, not always, but it was difficult for me when I was young. And even as I got older, was mob speak. Okay. To try and keep mob speak straight from when I would be in school with my classmates. And that became very difficult. Okay. I'll give you an example of that. I'm in fourth grade and they're teaching multiplication tables, right? That was in fourth grade. The teacher writes down 6 times 5 on the board. And I'm looking around the room and the teacher sees that obviously. He says, Scott, how much is 6 times 5? And I said, oh, that's 30. That's correct. And the reason I'm looking around, because in loan sharking, 6, it means that if you're coming in, if I'm going to borrow $500 from you, Dan, you would say to me, Scott, you can borrow, I'll give you the 500, but it's $600 interest you're going to have to pay. So if I don't have the $500 this week, where am I going to come up with $1,100 the next week? So when I saw this 6 times 5, what do you think I'm thinking? I'm only thinking about loan shark. Yeah. Okay, that's it. Just loan sharking.
Yeah, I could see how that would be really confusing.
This is the problem I had. I had to keep things trying. And the thing, I'll never forget, we're in Lexington, Kentucky. This was 1977. I was 29 years old. At that age, with my father, we're visiting someone in Lexington, Kentucky. Okay, we had a seat. And the wise guy says to my father, you took care of the thing, right? My father said, yes, I took care of the thing. It's almost done, but I've pretty much taken care of it. Don't worry, the thing is taken care of. So we're in the car and I said to my father, what was the thing? He said, Scott, the thing will be taken care of later. It's the thing that has to be taken care of. I said, you mean capital T-H-E, capital T-H-I-N-G? Yes, that thing. So again, I had, the mob speak was hard for me because I had to try and learn stuff and keep it separate from my classmates and everyone I'd see. It was difficult.
Was there any times where like communication broke down because of that? Like if you're trying to figure, I mean, I understand as a child be perhaps a little bit different than, somebody who's been in it for years and years who is actually carrying out those orders. But if you're having to use all these different code words and you're working with, from Chicago to Vegas to, I'm just thinking of even just accents and terms that people use across different geographical regions. I could see how it gets so confusing.
Yeah. Yeah, it would happen. Because like sometimes somebody would say something to my father, the thing. And I'll say, well, what's the thing about? My father says, well, I'm not really sure. I got to check it out. He would tell me. Because he would always tell me with wise guys, you always got to remember this, Scott. He said, always remember this. 90% what they tell you is lies. 10% is BS. So just think of it in this vein. If mom says she loves you, check it out. So when I do in-person presentations, I tell people, I'm sure you have a lovely mother, but if she says she loves you, check it out. Okay? Don't accept mom as the final word. And that's what it would be. A lot of times guys weren't always sure. When we went to see Joey Aiuppa in the MCC, after his trial, which was pretty much the beginning of the end of the outfit in Las Vegas. That's another story, obviously. And he says to my father, and this was after we saw Alan Dorfman, and the deal with Dorfman was after he was convicted, he was out on bond, and he was the only guy. It was a $5 million bond and put up so much of his insurance company. And he told the feds, the G, I have something big for you. I have something big. Well, when you're convicted, I will tell you this from experience, the G wants something big. If you're not convicted and they're just charging you, then that's a different story. But you got to have something really big for them to want to work with you at that point. So we had gone to see Dorfman, and my father says to him, Alan, look, you'll get a $12,000 a month pension. Okay, your health insurance for you and your wife will be taken care of for life. Just accept what's going to happen, possibly. Because his lawyer was telling him he thought he'd get maybe 15 years. And Dorfman had been in jail, like I say, in 1971 for 9 months. He said, I'm not going back. He kept saying, I'm not going back. I'm not going back. So we go to see Joey Aiuppa. And this is what Joey Aiuppa said. How did the Cubs do today? And my father said, well, the Cubs lost. So Joey Aiuppa says, well, I think it's time they make a lineup change. And that was the order on Alan Dorfman.
Wow. Yeah. I could see how there would be some confusion there for sure. Could be confusion for sure.
Oh, yeah. If you think you're right, you had a problem. Yeah.
Another movie that I wanted to touch on briefly is the 1997 movie called Donnie Brasco. Longtime listeners that listening to Based on a True Story, I actually talked with Joe Pistone, the real Donnie Brasco, back on episode number 173, who I believe that you've met as well. Do you think the movie Donnie Brasco did a good job showing how the mafia works?
I would say this, that he did an excellent job, and he deserves all the accolades and all the praise for the work that he did as 6 years undercover, which is unheard of. Normally 3 is the max. You don't keep a guy under for 6 years. He did an excellent, excellent job. However, and I will use baseball terminology, he really was 1 for 2. And what I say that is a lot of people, when they see the movie, all they're hearing, and most of the convictions were true, were Bonanno family, crime family members. But the Milwaukee crime family, who actually reported to Chicago, had Bonanno crime family ties. And he worked undercover as part of his undercover work. He had set up a vending machine company, and he had been introduced to Frank Ballesteri, who was head of the mob family in Milwaukee. They had about 50, 60 guys. Ballesteri never wanted to expand the family. He always wanted money. And so he worked with them and was eventually able to get them to say things on the wire and convict the Milwaukee family. Now, along with the Bonannos that he convicted at that time. But what happened was, and the case was 41 years ago, what happened was, sure, the Bonannos were kicked off the mob commission, but they eventually got back on. The lower level guys, the underboss, the captains, they probably were sitting in a place saying, thank you to Joe Pistone, because that now opened it up for them. I mean, he was able to convict the guys at that time. So the Bonanno family, those guys moved up, and eventually cases were made against them, and then guys replaced them. And today the Bonanno family is flourishing just like Joe Pistone did nothing. And it's not any knock against Joe Pistone because he put away the guys at that time.
Right.
Now, Milwaukee family was different. When Frank Ballesteri went away and his sons Joe Ball and John Ball, who were both lawyers, and Steve DeSalvo, who was his underboss, went away, the Milwaukee family pretty much dissolved. They were extinct quite yet, but all their operations in Wisconsin was taken over by the outfit. So there wasn't much of a mob family left in Milwaukee. And really today there might be a couple of 80-year-old guys, sitting around and talking, but there's really no action. So that's why I say 1 for 2. He put one family basically out of business, but the other family, the Bonanno family, they're flourishing today, just like all the other 4 families in New York, just like nothing ever happened. Okay. And again, it's nothing against him because his work was excellent and he put away those guys, but he never made a dent in the family. He just got rid of the guys at that time. And like my father would say, he would say about, politicians as well as in mob life, The faces change, but the nonsense remains the same.
Hmm.
So that's, whoever you put in, they're going to still follow the same nonsense. And the Bonanno family is just as active today as they were 41 years ago.
Wow. Wow. This kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier with having to show intent and having to have all of this evidence. There's so much work that has to
Yeah.
go into it. So you can get against these specific people like Pistone did against some specific people. But then there's going to be people to replace them.
That's the thing. So, I mean, sure, he can sit back, and Joe Pistone is 85 years old. He can sit back and say, I did a great thing. I can be very proud.
Mhm.
And all the awards he's gotten and all the shows he's been on, he deserves it. He deserves it because of the work he did. But when you look at the reality, and I'm a guy who looks at the reality, the Bonanno family was not extinct. They came back just as strong, just as hard. They're doing the same things they did 41 years ago. And even if you put guys away, in fact, now the guy who was the leader of the Bonanno family, he violated his parole. He's going away for 11 months. And they've already got a replacement for him for 11 months lined up. So, like I say, now some families, smaller families like Milwaukee, he made a dent. And, he was able to do a lot of damage to them and just about make them extinct. So that's what I mean, 1 for 2. Because he could never do anything with the Bonanno family. And if he was sitting there, I would tell you the same thing. And I believe he would agree with me.
Yeah.
That he did a great job at the guys at that time, 41 years ago. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes
And they
that makes
kind of
perfect
handled them wrong. Well,
Yeah. Yeah. You talked a little bit earlier about The Sopranos, and we've talked about movies so far, but I want to shift to talk about The Sopranos a little bit. As we've done with some of the others, if you were to take a step back and give The Sopranos a letter grade for how well it shows the life, what would you give it?
probably less than a D. Okay. You wouldn't have to go to summer school. But and I'll tell you why. Right off the bat, there is no way, Dan, there is no way that a mob family, Capogimi, Hoppo, could ever go to a psychiatrist. And I will tell you why. Okay. And I talk about this in Inside with the fictional character, maybe you read him, Eric Lido, who was gay. And that's based on someone who was gay. And he was a boss of a street crew. And I'll never forget how mad Sam Giancana, because he was one of his 42s. And the 42s was a gang that Sam Giancana had when he was a teenager. They went to a restaurant on Taylor Street called 42nd Street, which I think was a play on 42nd Street in New York. So everyone always referred to them as the 42s. And they were doing stick-ups, and they got noticed by the older guys. And the guy was... So what had happened was, in mob life, and this also happened with the Di Calcavante family, who was still functioning, not the Bayardo family, who was really not functioning anymore, who were the real Sopranos that David Chase used. In a mob family, okay, if a boss is gay, we'll use that as an example, like I did in my book. The order is given on him right away. The order is given on him. He's got to go. Okay, there's no calling him in. Let's talk about it. No sit down. He can be a made guy. Doesn't matter. He's going to go. Now, if you're a street crew member and you're a good earner, because again, as I said earlier, the first conversation of the day is about money. The last conversation of the day is about money. If you're a good earner, they're not going to like it. They're going to say to you, keep it off the street. Keep it off the street. In other words, don't kiss a guy on the corner. Okay, don't hold hands with a guy coming out of a gay bar. Keep it off the street because the guy's a good earner. A boss, no, a boss is going to go. Okay. Just like in an Inside, I talk about the difference between a gangster and a racketeer. And there's a big difference between the two. And basically with the outfit, we didn't have any racketeers. And the difference is a gangster will give an order right away. Let's do it. Let's go right now. Where a racketeer, we want to have a sit down. Not that they won't give the order. Okay. They'll give the order, but let's have a sit down. Because when a guy is made, especially when a guy is made, that's what you're supposed to do on a guy. Have a sit down. A gangster, no, he's not going to forget about it. I want that guy gone. He's going to be gone. I'm giving you the order. Give him his receipt. Go. Okay. And if the street crew picks up that you're a racketeer, they start functioning a little different because they don't have the confidence. It's like Dan, if you have a boss who's wishy-washy, or your listeners, God bless them, have a boss that's wishy-washy, you're going to sit there at your desk looking at your computer screen saying, I don't know if I should tell this guy anything because he's not going to do anything. He's wishy-washy.
Mm-hmm.
But if the boss is a strong leader, you'll feel confident. You'll go in and say, boss, look, I think we can do this better. This is my opinion, but boss, I want to bring this to you. And the boss will say, okay, Dan, that sounds good. Let me just look into it. But let me see what happens. And maybe 6 months, a year from now, that'll happen. Whatever you suggest will happen as far as policy in the company. That's a gangster. The racketeer will be wishy-washy. Dan, I'll get back to you. Maybe by the time you retire, he's still getting back to you. And a great crew doesn't like that. They want a guy who's strong. Because you have to remember, in mob life, everything is macho. Now, one time I asked my father, Dan, and I said to him, Dad, I got to ask you a question. I was kind of joking with, just like I'm joking a little bit with you and your listeners, of course. I said, do you ever think a woman could run the outfit, day-to-day operation? And I expected him to say, Scott, this is a guy's world. It could never happen. He says to me, Scott, let me ask you this. There are women in prison who have shot and killed their husband, shot and killed their boyfriend, maybe shot and killed their uncle. They've used a gun, haven't they? And I said, yeah, there are women in prison who have done it. I'm sure you've done in stories about women who have used guns. And he says, well, if a woman can shoot a gun, she can give an order, right? She's not afraid of giving an order on somebody. And I'd say, no, she wouldn't be afraid because if she pulls the trigger, she wouldn't be afraid of pulling the trigger on somebody. He said, therefore, a woman could run the outfit. He says, however, guys wouldn't respect her until she gave that order. Once she gave that order, then it would be a different story. So we never had a woman. I've never known a mob family that's had a woman, but it's the kind of surprised me what he told me, but it made a lot of sense because if she can pull a trigger, she's not afraid of shooting a gun. She's not afraid of giving the order because she's already physically able to pull a gun, pull a trigger, and she doesn't care about human life. It's not like, let's go for counseling. Okay. Right. That's not going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. That's not the answer that I would have expected from that either, but that's, wow.
And when you think about it, it does make sense,
Yeah, no, it does make sense. It does make sense. It's the mentality that's required to be the boss.
Absolutely. When I was 14 years old, my father waited till I was 14. I was a little more mature, and he explained to me what a sociopath behavior was, what a psychotic behavior was. And I always knew these guys were crazy. I always knew that there was something wrong with them, but I never knew the medical terms that would apply to their behaviors. And after that, then I knew what I was dealing with, like I say. So, yeah, if you have that mentality, and if a woman has that sociopath or psychotic mentality, yeah, she could do it.
Could do it. But they could never go to a psychiatrist like we see in Sopranos, huh?
Oh, no. Mr. Galdafani, who was a very good actor, would never have saw sunshine the next day. No, he would have been gone right away. As soon as they found out, he would have been gone, right away. Sam Giancana or Joey Aiuppa or Tony Accardo would have called my father, I want to see you tonight. And if my father could arrange it at 4 a.m. after meeting him, it would be arranged. He'd say, okay, I need 24 hours. You got 24. I know you'll do it. Get it done. He's gone. This is who's going to take over. Wow. And the street crew didn't always know, but they would eventually find out. And it happens. And like I say in my book, Eric Leto is based on a true guy, a real guy who they kept. My father, convinced Sam Giancana, look, he's bringing in money. Let's have a little talk with him. But he's bringing in a lot of money. And he was a very good earner. He was also part of the 42s. And that's what threw Sam Giancana. He says he used to hang out with us. He's, never showed any feminine sides to him. We didn't know. And it was hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Something we see throughout The Sopranos, we see a lot of the characters' families and their home life. We see, for example, Tony Soprano in the beginning of the series talks about how he's in waste management and the kids think that that's what their dad does for a living. But as the series continues, the kids, in particular, the Soprano family kids, the two kids, Meadow and AJ are the two kids. They start putting together two and two, and they start to realize that their dad is in the mafia. And some of their neighbors start to realize as well. Does The Sopranos do a good job of showing what it's like for the family and friends of someone in the mafia?
No, no, they didn't. And the thing is, when a guy goes away to prison, the kids are told either dad is going to college or dad has an out of town job. Okay, that's what the kids are told. Okay, because generally, and it happens where normally it's the Bureau of Prisons, BOP. They make the decision where somebody's going to be sent. It's not a judge. A lot of people will think the judge makes the decision. You know, the circuit court judge who's handling the case. No, he'll tell a defense lawyer, put it in writing, send it to BOP, and they'll make the decision. And they try and put you within 500 miles of your home. That's what they try and do. Some guys, it doesn't work that way. John Gotti was put in Marion, a level 6 prison, and that's more than 500 miles from New York in Southern Illinois, okay? So they would try and do that. But normally, what normally happens is guys don't talk at home. Kids don't really know what their father is doing. They don't talk about, say, well, I'm in waste management. No, they wouldn't say anything. And the wife would divert the conversation to something else. And the kids would just accept it, okay? And if dad was away, they were told that, well, dad's going to college. So some guys did a lot of postgraduate work, okay? They were away a lot. And other times they'd be told, okay, dad's got an out of town job. Well, dad's away for 20 years. He's got an out of town job. Now, there were some times some women would take the kids to a prison. If it was in, their 500-mile area, they would drive, and that's where it got rough. That's where the kids would start to figure it out. Why is dad locked up? What's happening? What's this happening? But most women, and that would be, it happened, but it was a little more rare. But most women, no, they wouldn't say anything at all, nothing. They would just go along. Like my mother told my father, she knew, he told her before they got married, and she said, just keep it out of the house. Keep it out of the house. And he never met with anybody in the house. He would talk with me. He'd go to churches. He'd go to bowling alleys. He'd go to cemeteries. But he didn't meet with anybody. He kept it out of the house.
Interesting. There is an interesting contrast that we see in The Sopranos specifically when talking about the kids. They seem to figure it out that their dad is in the mafia, but then they also haven't seen any violence. And it sounds similar to what you're talking about, keeping it out of the house. But there is, I think, specifically a scene. I think it's in season 5, episode 9. Meadow is telling her boyfriend that she never saw any violence growing up. Do you think it's realistic for children to never see any of that violence?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I saw it because I saw it. With me, I was a different circumstance. I didn't fit into that category. But no, they wouldn't, because they wouldn't know, because they wouldn't, if anything, a mom would say, well, if someone got older, say in their teens, and said, what does dad do? Well, he works for the state of Illinois. He works for the city of Chicago. And that's as much as they would say. They wouldn't see anything. But you had guys, and maybe this goes back to Tony Accardo. I call them New York animals. There were two guys, Charles Scarfo, who I first worked for. He would talk about his murders in front of the kids at home, okay? And Vincent Giaganti was known as the odd father because he would dress like he was mentally incompetent to stay out of things. He would talk about his beatings in front of his daughter, what he did, his violence. And Giaganti was actually the number one hammer, the number one shooter for Vito Genovese. And eventually he became boss of the Genovese crime family. But he would talk about it at home. So you did have guys that maybe would talk about it, but that was rare, like I say, because guys don't like my father would always say to me, Scott, you never want to be a radio. You never want to broadcast. So guys never wanted anybody to know, because if, say, Soprano kids tell somebody and say that kid's uncle is a cop, and that guy said, boy, these Soprano kids, Uncle Al, boy, I could tell you some stuff about them. And all of a sudden, Uncle Al is going to his boss and says, I might have a contact of what the Sopranos are doing. See, and it might just be very minutia, but it's still right away you're going to hear about it from your father. Why are you talking to this guy? Why are you saying that? That's why my father would always say, keep every conversation vanilla. Okay, keep it vanilla. I said, what about chocolate? He said, no, keep it vanilla. He said, just you talk about sports, how's your family, the weather, nothing that's ever going to hurt you, nothing that's ever going to come back and bite you. You never give up anything to anybody.
Huh. Wow. Yeah, that is very different than what we see in The Sopranos, specifically. Of course, but it makes sense, because you never know. Like, it might be something small, but it might not. You don't know.
Well, sometimes the smallest thing, it's like an onion. My father always said, always remember, the more you peel back the onion, the smell gets worse. The smell gets worse.
Yep.
And a little thing can lead to something bigger. Okay. It can lead to something bigger. It might be very small in the beginning, but it can open the door for something else. And if nobody knows what you do, I mean, I've had guys in the neighborhood that got copies of my book. I'm talking about someone who became a CPA or a lawyer, people like yourself, normal, regular people. I hope you're normal, regular, but we'll find out. And because we'll have Big Louie and Guido, they make house calls. So we'll find out if there's a problem with you. I'm kidding you. But when they bought my book, they said, your dad was such a nice guy. When we'd see him out there, we'd say, hi, Mr. Hoffman. He was very nice. And when I was a kid, there was this company called Good Humor, and they would come with the ice cream at night through the neighborhood. And he said he'd buy us an ice cream from Good Humor truck. Can't believe that this was your father. And I said, well, that's what he wanted you to think. Because if everyone thinks he's a nice guy and he's this and he's that, no one's ever going to think that there's another side. Like my father would say, always remember, every life story is like a pancake. It has two sides. But if you stay on the top of it and don't flip the pancake over, you're never going to know what's underneath. And that was a real problem with a lot of guys who could not separate women from the business. Oh, that was bad. That's what killed Bugsy Siegel. Virginia Hill set him up. Okay, that's what it was all about. So guys didn't do it. They didn't always do it.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, it's hard. I mean, basically living a double life, and not everybody can do that.
No, it was hard. It was hard for me as a kid, in the sense because I had to fit in with my classmates. I had to fit in with kids in the neighborhood. I had to fit in. So I would have to take different postures on different things and just try and fit in with them and be like them. But it was hard because, again, I never had birthdays. I never had bicycle. My father never had a game of catch with me. It was a wise guy that took me to my first baseball game at Wrigley Field to see the Cubs. So we never did, or bowling, or, things that maybe your dad would do with you, as a child, as a son, especially. But that never happened. None of that stuff ever happened. And I was an adult when I was a kid, but I still had a kid's brain. So it was not easy to try and decipher because I was a very shy, very quiet child. That's why my father, when he'd send me out with juice collectors, street enforcers, the muscle, he'd say, don't worry, Scott, we'll never say anything. Don't worry. And it was the truth. It was very much the truth. I was that quiet of a kid, that shy of a kid. My mother would have to come in the room if I was reading a library book just to see what was going on because there was no noise coming from the room. Nothing was happening. So, like I said, I was that type of child. So I was trusted. I was always trusted. When I graduated college in 1971, Tony Ricardo says, I'd like to talk to you. And I said, okay, sure. So I went to his house at Forest suburb. And he says, Scott, I know you told your dad you're not interested in being active. And I told my father at that point, I wasn't going to be active, but I'd still be an observer. And sometimes when I do the in-person presentation, someone says, what's the difference? I said, well, the difference is when you're active, they can charge you. When you're an observer, you're not involved. So how are they going to charge you? What are they going to charge you with? Where's the evidence? You observe, you walk away. Got to remember, you're not doing the criminal acts as an active person. And so he said to me, Scott, have you thought about it? And I says, Tony, it's just not for me. And I think what I'm doing with my life is going to be the best for me. And he says, you're good at it. And I says, yeah. I says, I'm good at it, but it's still not for me. And the reason, Dan, I always tell people it's what I saw, but that was never the reason. That was never, ever the reason. The reason was I could never be my father. Okay. My father was in the life over 55 years, never went to jail, but he was good at what he did. He was good at what he did. And one time I asked him, because my father in high school got friendly with the assistant principal, because my father worked at the cafeteria to get a free lunch. And the assistant principal says, "You're kind of a smart guy. Let me check your grades and everything." And he saw it. My father was a good student. And he said, "Well, what do you want to do? You want to go on to college?" In those days, kids didn't go on to college, of course. My father says, "You know what? I'd like to be a surgeon. You want to be a medical doctor?" And the principal says, "Well, let me see what I can do." And he had a friend at the University of Chicago. He showed him a copy of my father's grades. And they were willing to offer him an academic scholarship to go to the University of Chicago as a pre-med student, much like Michael Franzese, okay? He was a pre-med major at Hofstra, a guy with a lot of talent, but he went the other way. But a guy who was very smart, a lot of talent. So the vice principal tells my father, "I can get you into the University of Chicago. You could be a pre-med major." And my father was very excited, of course. And this was going into his senior year. And he goes home and tells my grandmother, and she says, "Oh, that's well and good, but you have to get a job." And that was the end of the college career. Now, my father was very handy. He could do electrical work. He could do carpentry. He could do plumbing. He didn't like it, but if a plumber talked to him, they always thought he was a plumber. He could reupholster furniture. He could read blueprints. He worked on cars. So he could have been a building superintendent. So he had options. Dan, he had options. So one time I said to him later in life, I was maybe in my 40s at that. It was near the end of his life because he died of bladder cancer. And I said to him, "Dad, why did you go into the light? Why did you go into the light?" And he looks at me and says, "Scott, everybody needs a hobby." And I said, "Well, you could have picked a different hobby. You know, you didn't have to go into the light for a hobby." And that was his answer.
Huh.
He got in, he needed a job. He met Sam Giancana, and everything started from there. Everything started. Sam Giancana introduced him to Paul Ricca because Sam Giancana was a protege of Paul Ricca. He introduced him to Paul Ricca after interviewing him. Says, "Yeah, I'd like you to come and work with me." That's how it all started.
Wow. Something that I found interesting in The Sopranos, if we go back to that, is how it references some of the movies that we've even talked about today, like Goodfellas and Casino. There's even one scene where one of Tony's neighbors asks Tony how realistic The Godfather was. And granted, a lot of movies depict things that have happened decades before they were made. But since this podcast is about how realistic movies are, I have to ask, what do you think the Mafia's perspective was on movies about the Mafia?
Well, I'll tell you, after The Godfather came out, now normally the guy who's in charge, we'll say Sam Giancana running day-to-day operation, or you could say Tony Accardo, who was the equivalent of like the CEO, okay? And Sam Giancana would have been, say, the vice president or the president of the company, not the CEO, of course. And after the movie The Godfather came out, now the real term that you call someone is a Don, and that goes back to the Sicilian mob in Sicily. You call the guy a Don. That's what you call him. After the movie came out, then even wise guys are saying, "Oh, The Godfather." They're calling everybody The Godfather. You know, they used the terminology. Everyone was The Godfather. All of a sudden, that. And most of the perspective was, it's entertainment, and that's about it. But the movie The Godfather kind of struck a chord, as far as the terminology. And I know it struck a chord with Frank Sinatra, and that's another story about his lawsuit. Okay. And I know why. And I remember him telling me why he called Mario Puzo, told him to choke on it. Yeah, I know about that. The author of the book, The Godfather. Yeah. Joe Colombo also had a lawsuit going about defamation to Italians. He originally had the Italian Anti-Defamation League, and it became the Italian Civil Rights League. Frank's lawsuit was basically the same, but that wasn't the reason. That's a whole long other story of what the real reason. He told Mario Puzo to choke on it, okay? And they met each other in Chasen's restaurant in Los Angeles, which was a very famous restaurant, I think on Hollywood Boulevard, maybe it was on the Strip. It was really known for its trying to think of the word here, chili. They were really known for their really good chili. But it was a place, if you wanted a people watch, you had all the celebrities come in there. So you grab a table and, oh, there's Kirk Douglas, or there's, so-and-so. And he saw him there, and he had to be restrained. He was going after Mario Puzo, in the restaurant. Okay. So, yeah, I remember why when he said that. and told Puzo to choke on it.
Wow.
Yeah. Because
Wow.
Francis Ford Coppola had sent him the script for Johnny Fontaine. And he took his red pen. He told me he took his red pen and he crossed stuff out and take this out, take that out. And Coppola wasn't going to do it. So Coppola then called Vic Damone. Now, Vic Damone was a good friend of Frank's. And he called Frank. He says, Francis Ford Coppola has come to me about playing Johnny Fontaine. And he says, Frank says, don't take it. Don't take it. You understand? Don't take it. Vic Damone turned it down. Then they got Al Martino, who had gone to England, because Martino had problems with the Philadelphia mob in Philly. So he had to leave the country. That's where he made, I think, Spanish Eyes, his big song, Spanish Eyes. I think it was in England that he made it. And that's when they contacted Al Martino. And Martino took the part. But in the movie, the part was very short. If you remember, it was very, very short, just at a wedding scene. That's all it was, very, very short. But yeah, Frank was hot. Even 10 years later, when I saw Frank in Las Vegas, he said, I'll cook dinner for you. Frank used to like to cook dinner. That was his way of relaxing. So we're sitting, and this is after he'd married Barbara Marx, and she wasn't there. One of the Marx brothers, Zepeto Marx. He started dating her, and she divorced Zepeto. Okay. And so we're starting, all of a sudden, he starts referring to the Godfather. He says, I got that part legit. I got that part legit. I said, Frank, of course you got it legit. I don't know any other reason that you didn't get it legit. And that's where it's a bigger story, what really happened. And why he was mad at Puzo, because he thought Puzo knew something that wasn't true. And Puzo really didn't. And Puzo's defense, he really didn't know. But as far as Frank was concerned, yeah, he knew something, told him to choke on it. And I said, then he's calling Russell Buffalino. Okay. Russell Buffalino was one of the characters in The Irishman. Okay. I knew Buffalino. He's calling Buffalino about maybe breaking Puzo's legs.
Wow.
But Buffalino didn't follow through. He let it go. Because Frank sometimes, his temper, the Jack Daniels, he was a good guy. He was a very good guy. I remember when he got Joe Louis the job. Joe Louis was out of money because all these women he was dating were taking him just for the money. And he got him the job as a greeter at Caesar's Palace. Frank was a good guy in that way. He would help people. But he would call Buffalino, and Buffalino basically said, I'll get back to you. Buffalino was hardcore like Cosa Nostra. Hardcore. I mean, he was the type of guy. He was a slow anger guy. He wasn't like Anthony Provenzano, who's also in The Irishman. That's another story, is that movie. But Buffalino was the type of guy, if he had to do something for La Cosa Nostra, I remember when his wife was pregnant, okay, and her bag broke. And she said, I got to go. The bag broke. And he says, I got to go to a meeting. Tell the neighbor. Okay. And he walks out the door. And she went and got the neighbor who drove her to the hospital. But this was, Buffalino. But Buffalino let this one go. He let this one. Because sometimes they get mad at Frank, because sometimes he'd say to someone, if he got mad, you want your legs broken? And there's another story with him and J. Edgar Hoover. But that's another story.
Yeah, it sounds like we have quite a few other stories to cover perhaps in the future. But for someone who says a listener who's listening to this and they've only seen Mafia movies, they haven't really dug into any of the true stories. What do you think they would be surprised to learn about the real Mafia that they just don't show in the movies?
I would say probably the violence that they will commit to get money, that they don't care. Like in my book, Inside, in the part where I'm talking about a juice collector goes looking for a guy, and his wife is very pregnant. She must have been at least 7-8 months pregnant, at least. And what really happened, I had to water it down. What really, really happened, okay? So with them, it was always the ends justified the means. And if it was about money, we don't care. But with them also, you have to remember that they still had a family. So there were a lot of guys that when they would go home, they flipped the switch. They would try and be a father or try and be a husband. And there were guys that were okay until you put a gun in their hand. And then they flipped the switch the other way and became very violent. As long as you weren't in their business, because I've had people tell me, oh, so-and-so lived on my block. He said hello to me. And I'd say, you weren't in his business. When you're in the business, then everything changes. But if Dan, you were in the business and someone says, what's Dan Lefevre? What's it? He's a nice guy. He says hello to me, wishes me Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Very nice, very pleasant. But the real Dan Lefevre, that's in the business, in the life, that's not how you're going to work. So if you're in the life, like my father used to say, in the life, always remember, Scott, We know people that are coming to us. We don't go door to door to solicit, which is true. They weren't on the street corner handing out cards for business. People were coming to them for gambling money, for gambling, extortion, money laundering, all these things that I saw. Adult pornography, child pornography, labor racketeering, okay? Everything that I saw that included mob life, all the schemes, the scams. Yeah. So, he'd always say that to me. Always remember, we're not selling encyclopedias door to door, okay? People are coming to us. That's why people would say to me, didn't he care? Because my father was involved as far as the organization part. Once he got the order, there's been over 1,200 murders in the history of the outfit. They've been around for 120 years. And he's been involved with close to 300 as far as organizing. And did it ever bother him? Not once. Not once at all.
So what was Marilyn Monroe doing in Chicago at that time?
Well, at that time, Marilyn Monroe, she had finished her last movie called The Misfits. Okay. And a few months after the movie, Clark Gable was in the movie, and both of them, not together, but separately, were supposed to do promotions for the movie. And he died a few months after the filming of a heart attack. So he was never able to go on any promotions. And she had gone to New York for the premiere in February of 1961. Okay. And she had gone with, at that time, he was already her ex-husband, Arthur Miller, who in January, my father told me in January 25th, I think, of 1961, they went to Juarez, Mexico and got a quickie divorce. So they actually were divorced. But see, he was a screenwriter, and everyone always knew Arthur Miller as this brilliant playwright, okay? Because that's basically what he was known for, was his playwriting ability on Broadway. But he was the screenwriter for the movie, and John Huston was the director. So she was coming to Chicago, do a promotion. Sam Giancana said to my father, how would Scott like to meet Marilyn Monroe? Now, Marilyn Monroe was, which is a long, long story and another long story. She was there right from the beginning with the Kennedys and the outfit when everything started. That's another story. And of course, my father says, I'm sure anyone, I was 12 and a half years old at that time. He says, anyone 12 and a half and up, any male would want to meet Marilyn Monroe. So he told me, he says, great. So she had come in and was staying at the Blackstone Hotel, which is still in business. But the Blackstone Hotel on Saturday night was mob prostitution there. It was one of the places, but that just on Saturday night. So I'm sure the current owners would be very happy to know that their place, their hotel, was used for mob prostitution on Saturday night. That was the only night. They were not the 7-day-a-week place like some other hotels in downtown Chicago. And so she came and we started talking, and she told me, she said, that was her movie. And right away I said to her, I said, well, you know my grandfather. And she says, well, how do I know your grandfather? I said, because my grandfather was the photographer that shot you for the July 1953 first edition of Playboy magazine, the cover. And if you go and you look on the line, you'll see the cover, and I'll tell you why this way. And she says, oh, yeah, I remember your grandfather. And she says, yeah, he was good, but I remember your grandfather. And I'll tell you in a second why that happened. Now, Hugh Hefner had heard about my grandfather being a very good portrait photographer. There was a specific reason why he wanted my grandfather to shoot the cover. And the reason was, in those days, they didn't have airbrushes. So my grandfather, by hand, would put in all the skin tones on the face, the arms, even at the part of the breast that she's showing on the cover. Everything was put in by hand. So when the pictures were developed, everything looks natural. If you were to look, or your listeners were to look at that July 1953 edition, first one, it would look all normal to them. Just like you look normal to me, and I probably look normal to you, the skin tones. And Hugh Hefner told my father, I'll pay you $50. Well, in 1953, that was a lot of money. $50 was a lot of money. Because you have to remember, in those days, the newspaper was maybe 5 cents, 6 cents. The CTA, Chicago Transit Authority, take a bus was 10 cents. Gas was maybe 15 cents a gallon, maybe. The rent was maybe $40 a month, $45. So $50 was a lot of money. You could buy a lot of food. And Hefner didn't have the money, but his father, Glenn, who gave him the money to start the magazine, gave him the $50. His father was an accountant. Glenn was an accountant. So my grandfather, and then he talked to my grandfather about shooting the centerfold part. My grandfather said, no, I don't do that. And because my grandfather liked to shoot weddings and, people that were going to get married, family stuff. He didn't really go for that. And he really wasn't too hip on even doing the magazine, but the $50 enticed him. So Hugh Hefner says, well, when do you want Marilyn Monroe there? And my father says, okay, is she in town? He says, yes, she's in town at that time. And okay, I want her there 7:30 in the morning. Because my grandfather always said, you have to do someone early, especially a celebrity, those type of people. You have to do them early in the morning before they start getting busy. And then they might get tired, not follow instructions later on in the day. So Hefner said, fine, okay, 7:30 is fine. So 7:30 comes, 7:30 goes, 8:30, 9:30, 10:30, 11:30, 12:30, she walks in with some. Now, my grandfather had a young couple who was getting married, but wanted to take some pre-wedding photos, okay? And my grandfather, again, by hand, would put in the skin tones and everything. And they had a 1:00 appointment. So she comes in at 12:30 and says to my grandfather, I'm Marilyn Monroe. He said, I know who you are. You were supposed to be here at 7:30 and you didn't show up. I've got someone scheduled at 1. And he said, I'm not doing you. He says, you can walk out the door right now. And my grandfather had come from Poland at the age of 13, and he was already a photographer at that point. So he had been in the business a long time. And for the people your listeners that are Polish, they'll understand what I say, the Polish temper, which sometimes could get a little sharp. Okay. And so she says, well, I'm here. And he says, I don't care who you are, what you're here. I have somebody at 1:00. And just like your appointment was at 7:30, I wouldn't have taken anybody ahead of you. You might as well leave right now. Go. So she left. And later that afternoon, he gets a call from Hugh Hefner. And Hugh Hefner says, well, can I get her in tomorrow? Can she come tomorrow? My grandfather says, okay, I'll give her one more chance. And that's it. Otherwise, you get somebody else to do the shooting. Did you have her at 7:30? And then I will do the shooting of her. Okay. And he said, yes, she'll be there. And the next day she was there at 7:30. And it took about 2.5 hours. He spent a lot of time, a lot of different angles, taking different pictures. And of course, later on with the negatives, he put everything in by hand. So she's telling me, she says, your grandfather was very good, but he was tough. She said, I guess I pushed the envelope a little too much. And I said, yeah. I said, you got to remember, I said, my grandfather, I was the only grandchild that he would let turn on the television. He didn't even like the other grandkids. Okay. So he was, he had his favorite. I was the one. He liked me. I was quiet, shy kid. And, we'd come over, we'd watch wrestling on television or something. And he took more than me. So we're talking and she's telling me about her life. She had a very hard life. Her mother was a schizophrenic, in and out of asylums. And when she was born, she was put right away into a foster home, right away, right from birth. And she was in 12 consecutive foster homes and eventually an orphanage. And eventually she was able to track down her biological father. And I said, well, what did he say when you met? And she says, I told him I'm Marilyn Monroe. And he said, yeah, I can see you're Marilyn Monroe. She said, I'm your daughter. And he said, I'm married now. I have my own family. Call my lawyer. And he walked away from her and never made any contact with her at all. Never wanted to make any contact. Wow. And this bothered her. Her head started to drop a little bit. And you can see when someone's hurt and their head drops a little bit. You can see in their eyes. You look at the body language, see. And so, I could see right away. So I stopped the subject. I said, well, look, you've been very, very successful in life. And it was his loss, not your gain. Okay. And then she says to me, well, how old are you? And I said, well, I'm 12 and a half years old. Kids at a certain age, they always throw in that half year.
Right,
Maybe
yeah.
you did it when you were a kid.
Oh, yeah.
And she says, yeah, 12 and a half going out 40. She says, 12 and a half going out 40. And then she says to me, you've lived, 1,000 lives? I said, maybe 1,001. She started laughing. For what she didn't know that I knew, the 1959 movie of Some Like It Hot with Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon, I knew how she got the role. She was not the original one who was supposed to get the role. Jack Lemmon wanted Shirley MacLaine. He had done Summer Stock with Shirley MacLaine. He wanted Shirley MacLaine. He had won the Academy Award for the movie Mr. Roberts as a Best Supporting Actor. So he thought he had all the juice to get her in. And Billy Wilder had agreed. Well, there was an investor who had put a lot of money into this movie, okay, as an investor. And he had outfit ties. And Sam Giancana called my father and says, well, we got to get Marilyn Monroe the part hip. Sidney Korshak, Mr. Korshak, lawyer, Sidney Korshak, call the studio. And Sidney Korshak called the studio. And Marilyn Monroe was called in for a screen test. But it was already rigged. She was going to get the part. And they went through the motion and made it look like, oh, this is official, okay? This is like when we used to go fix cases with circuit court judges. They sit there, yeah, okay, you didn't get due process. Well, the case was fixed to begin with. And she got the part. It was very successful. It was a very successful movie about gangsters in Chicago dressing up as women. And, but she didn't know I knew that, okay? She didn't know I knew that. So I said, I really enjoyed Some Like It Hot. I said, Miss Monroe, you were really good. She said, you can call me Marilyn. I said, okay, thank you. And in my book, Inside, I talk about my father always telling me with wise guys, you call him by Mr. So-and-so, and if he's with a woman, if it's his wife, you call her Miss So-and-so, or if it's his side girl, it's Miss. Never until he tells you. You respect him. Never until he tells you, which was, it was a long time before I'd call Sam Giancana Sam or Tony Accardo Tony, until they gave me the go-ahead. Said, Scott, why don't you call us, by our first name? And I'd say, well, my father wants me to respect you. He said, I know your father, you call us. And so, we continued talking, and we must have talked for a good hour and 45 minutes,
Wow.
And she was going back with Joe DiMaggio. She says, you remember Joe DiMaggio? I said, Joe D had 361 home runs, played 15 years with the Yankees. She says, maybe you should be dating. Because they had been divorced. I think they were married a year. It was real short. They were married a year. And they got back together the second time, but of course it didn't work out. And years later, I saw Joe DiMaggio at a baseball show in Las Vegas many years later, after Marilyn Monroe died. And he always said, the Kennedys killed her. The Kennedys killed her. He really was hot. Because every year on her birthday, we go to Forest Lawn. I think she's buried in Forest Lawn in Los Angeles. He'd bring flowers every year. He loved her very much. But he was old school Italian, and she wasn't that type of woman. Okay, she wasn't going to put up with that. He wanted her to be like his mother, basically. That's really what it was about. That's what she told me. I said, good luck with Mr. DiMaggio, and then we left. So now she was about, with the Kennedys, like I say, and going back with the outfit from the beginning. And I always remember I was with my father in Oak Park when he gave the order on Marilyn Monroe. Okay, and he gave the order on Marilyn Monroe to my father and told him the two mobsters he wanted to be sent to Los Angeles to carry out the order. And my father always told me from the beginning, you have to carry out the order no matter what it is. You must carry it out. Otherwise, next time, you're going to be the next order. So you got to carry it out. So we leave and we're in the car. And I'm looking at his face. I said, you going to carry it out? He says, yeah, we'll take care of it. I'll get back to him. We'll take care of it. And he sat on it, and he sat on it, and he sat on it. And he kept telling Sam Giancana, yeah, I'm working on it. He said, okay, because Sam Giancana always trusts him because they knew each other at that point almost 40 years, okay? He said, okay, I know, Dave, you're going to take care of it. Yeah, okay. He sat on it, and finally, he told Sam Giancana, they're going out tomorrow. And that was the day when they found Marilyn Monroe's body. And that's another story, because I met Thomas Noguchi, the coroner, in 1975. And they said, why didn't you do a toxicology report? Because on her death certificate, it says probable suicide. It does not say suicide. Probable suicide. Well, probable leaves the door open because it's not saying suicide. It's saying probable. Could be something else. I said to him, well, you've seen the photos. And he started to get a little antsy with me. He said, what photos? And I said, the ones that were taken by the coroner's office, which I had seen through somebody else, through a friend. Everyone in the mob life was a friend. It showed me the pictures. She had bruises on her body. So that means she was fighting back. Okay. She was fighting back. And he says, I don't know anything. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe you're right. I don't know. And we didn't do the toxicology report. And that was it. And he's walking away. Okay. So I got some opinions on really what happened, with her there. And I'm not saying it was the way that the story came out. But like a lot of things are not always the way the story comes out.
Yeah, there's what the public hears, and then there's the way that things actually happen. They don't always align. That's for sure.
Well, that'd be like in Las Vegas. I mean, I'd see entertainers, and you'd see them on television, but then I'd see what they were like in what their private face was. My father always called it private face, and you'd see that with entertainers. And you'd see them on television, and you were thinking, oh, they're this way, they're that way, and that wasn't always the case. That was not always the case at all. At all. Some were very bad, some were very good.
Yeah.
And the ones that were good often surprised you. The ones that were bad, they would surprise you too.
Guess you never know. You never know.
No, you didn't know because you didn't know them. You only saw them on television.
Yeah.
It's like people watching mob movies.
Exactly.
They only see what they see.
Yeah. You only know what's in front, what has been scripted out in front of you.
That's it. I mean, they read my book inside, then they'll see.
Yeah.
But, they only see what they see, and they think that's how it is. And they think, oh, the life is glamorous and all. And it's really not. It's a lot of pressure. My father used to always say, Dan, that being in the life was a two-shouldered operation. He says, over the left shoulder, you're looking to see who's going to try and kill you. The right shoulder, you're looking to see the G trying to make cases and put you away for a lifetime. So it was a lot of pressure. But for him, it never bothered him. The pressure just didn't bother him. But for someone like Paul Ricca, he used to cook a lot. That was his way of relieving the pressure. Sam Giancana was sex. It was always women's sex. Tony Accardo had wood in his backyard. He chopped the wood to release the tension. But with my father, no. Maybe that's why he called it a hobby, But he was able to. He never had something that he had to release. Maybe because he understood what had to be done, and he treated it that way. And it was a business. To him, I think, was always a business.
Yeah. That makes sense. That everybody's different in what they can handle and what they can't, and if they need that release versus some people don't.
Yeah, I mean, just like sometimes you'll see in a family, there's always one kid who's going to take care of mom and dad, and the other five are going to say, well, you're going to you take mom to the doctor, you take dad. And you say, wait a minute, you got 5 other brothers and sisters. Why can't you divide up the time? Why does all the pressure have to be on the one kid, all on their shoulders? But you see that.
Yeah.
And that's how it was a lot of times in mob life. I hear stuff through the mob grapevine, but because I know how the G works, I know what they're doing, the cases they're trying to make. So I'll hear stuff through the grapevine. Guys want to talk to me because there's certain things that I know that go beyond statute of limitations. So that tells you what it could be. But I don't rat anybody out, just like I don't give up anybody who's in the WPP, the Witness Protection Plan program. I don't give up anybody. I really don't. The only time I would tell somebody, as far as like an Irish name, because he took himself out after a year with Sammy Gravano. He didn't want the restrictions. He took himself out after a year because he was in Phoenix. He's still in Phoenix, living in Phoenix. And his name was Joey O'Brien. That was the name they gave Sammy Gravano, Joey O'Brien. So, but that's because he took himself out of the program. But otherwise, I don't give up anybody. I don't rat anybody out.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to chat about the Mafia and the movies. I know you talked about your book inside there. Can you give an overview of your book and where listeners can pick up their own copy?
Sure. Basically, my book it's individual stories. While it's fictional, it's composites of real people and real events. And I've not had anybody tell me they disliked the book. Okay. And some people said to me, maybe they're afraid to tell you they dislike the book. And I said, no. I said, I'll give you a fast example. I was in a restaurant where an older couple had bought the book. And I said, because I always tell people, if you buy the book and you see me, catch me, I'll sign it. And I signed the book. And this guy is standing next to me and we're talking. I'm talking with the husband and wife. He says, boy, this sounds really interesting. And I said, I'll give you the information. He says, I haven't read a book in 38 years. He said, when I graduated high school, that was the last time I read a book. I have not read a book. So I said to him, sir, I said, look, I'll give you the information how to get it. I'll tell that in a second. And if you read it and you don't like it, I will reimburse you. Because I used to see him in the restaurant where I went for dinner. I will reimburse you the cost. It won't cost you a darn thing. He says, that's fair enough. I gave him the information and he got the book on a Friday. I saw him like the next Tuesday, Wednesday. He said to me, Mr. Hoffman, I got the book on a Friday. I couldn't stop reading it. I read the whole weekend. He says, that's all I'm doing. So to get my book, if you go on Amazon and put in Scott, Scott, middle initial M, last name Hoffman, Hoffman, and the word inside, you will see the book. And the book is sold as a paperback, also sold as Kindle. And I've had some people buy it as Kindle because they like to read it on the train or, or on a commuter bus or something. They do that. So, but again, I haven't had anybody that said they didn't like it. But then again, maybe the guy's right. Maybe they're afraid to tell me, no, I wouldn't do anything. Nothing's going to happen. I said, I'll kid with people. I'll say, well, Big Louie and Guido, they make house calls. And, people get shaky. I'm just kidding you. I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
Well, thank you again so much for your time, Scott. Again, I will include a link to your book inside in the show notes for this so people can pick up a copy and learn what it's really like.
Yes. Yeah, like I say, though, while the book is fictional, but they'll be able to pick up on stuff because it's not written in chapters. It's one story after another, as you've seen. So thank you, Dan, very much. And again, thank your listeners very, very much for having patience with me.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Scott Hoffman once again for coming on the show to talk about the Mafia in the movies. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, go pick up Scott's book called Inside to hear some more Mafia stories. You can find a link to it in the show notes for this episode, or you can always find it on the show's home on the web, basedonatruestorypodcast.com/286. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie. Number 1, there have been over 1,200 murders in the history of the outfit. Number 2, Scott's grandfather photographed Marilyn Monroe. Number 3, the outfit in Chicago made about 10% of their income from the casinos in Las Vegas. Did you catch which one is a lie? Let's count it down. We'll start with number 3. The outfit in Chicago made about 10% of their income from the casinos in Las Vegas. Immediately, we have the lie. Scott told us how at one point the outfit was making about $200 million and 50% of that, or $100 million, was coming from Las Vegas. That means number 2 is true. Scott's grandfather photographed Marilyn Monroe. Scott told us the story of how his grandfather photographed Marilyn Monroe for Playboy, as well as how he himself talked to Marilyn about it many years later. And that means number 1 is also true. There have been over 1,200 murders in the history of the outfit. Scott shared that staggering number with us, including the fact that his father was involved in organizing about 300 of those. It's a somber reminder of the life that so many movies glorify, while we don't know about the people who have lost their lives at their hands. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Don't forget that if you heard ads on today's episode, you can get rid of those by subscribing to the producer's feed, either in Apple Podcasts or on Patreon. Learn all about that over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/value, or use the link in the show notes. That's all for today. Until next time, thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon.